Welcome to the show, everybody. I'm your host, Byron Pace. It is the 23rd of November, 2020. Today, I have the great privilege of speaking to Christine Figgener, who is a sea turtle biologist based in Costa Rica. She was named as one of the next generation leaders by Time magazine and has been involved in documentary filming work for both Nat Geo and the BBC. Currently, she sits as a director of education for the Footprint Foundation. And we're going to be talking about some of her research, including the work that she undertook when she was studying for her PhD, which looked at trophic and movement ecology of sea turtles. It's a really intriguing show. There's some technical details in here, which hopefully we do a good job of explaining exactly what they mean and how it works. I learned so much speaking to Christine. So we're going to jump straight in, but don't forget, if you like the kind of conversations that we have on this podcast, then it's probably worth checking out my monthly column, which you can read on modernhuntsman.com. Look for the Into the Anthropocene column with my name on it, Byron Pace. And every month I bring a selection of really interesting science stories from around the world. And if you can't remember that, the link is also in the show notes. And lastly, if you would like to support this show, head over to patreon.com/Byron Pace, and there's a whole variety of tiers on there, and you can help make these shows possible. Thank you very much. I hope that you enjoy this fascinating conversation with Christine Figgener. Christine, welcome to the show. It's really great to be speaking to you from the other side of the world. I know that you've had some terrible weather where you are the last couple of weeks, and we had to delay this a little bit just to make sure we had stable internet connection. How is everything where you are? What's the kind of state of play in the country?
Yeah, we are pretty much back to normal right now. So it's pretty sunny outside, so I'm sitting here sweating. But yeah.
I know, because I asked you to turn your fan off.
Yeah, it's fine. I mean, if I don't respond at one point, it's probably because I had a heat stroke. But other than that.
Okay, well, we'll try and get this done before you have a heat stroke. Just by way of intro, but this is absolutely not going to be the main thing that we focus this conversation on. So I think a lot of people might know who you are, even if they don't quite realize they know who you are, because you put out a video a couple of years ago now, I think it was, of a plastic straw being pulled out of the nose of a turtle. That was you that was filming it. Just explain very briefly how that came about and what the kind of fallout for that was, because it was a fairly successful catalyst in this campaign to start removing some elements of plastic from the ocean.
Yeah, so it was 5 years ago, actually, at this point. And it was during the research of my PhD project. So we were capturing turtles, and we just found this one specific male that had something funny encrusted in its nose. And I had a colleague visiting that day on the boat that we used, and he was interested in the critters that live on turtles, the actobionts, and he was about to remove that thing. And since I had been done with my part of the data collection already, I just decided to film the whole thing. And so a lot of people are actually very familiar with my voice that have watched that movie or this film clip.
After that came out, there was, a number of big companies around the world stopped using plastic straws. Am I correct?
Yeah. So, well, I don't want to claim that, we started it all, because there have been really hundreds of people that already had been working on the issue of single-use plastics, but it had been for sure a great catalyst for just a bigger wave of change. And so there is Disney, Alaska Airlines, Starbucks, that really now are phasing out single-use plastic straws. And there's so many more governments in the world that also have been starting at least to think about what kind of single-use plastic they could phase out in future. So, I mean, that's a pretty awesome, result of that video.
Yeah. Two questions just come off the back of this before I dig into the sort of main thing that I wanted to speak to you about for this episode. And this is maybe a slightly controversial statement, but I've heard people talk about it before. Do you think that this really quite successful drive to raise awareness of the use of all plastics in our lifestyle has kind of overshadowed or removed possibly a more important focus, which is on this bigger picture of climate change?
You know what? I don't think it has removed it, because what people tend to forget is that these two issues actually go hand in hand, because plastics are made from fossil fuels, right? And fossil fuels, or the producers of fossil fuels, are actually pretty much the dinosaurs. They're about to go extinct, and they're looking for ways of how they can still use fossil fuels in future, and they're trying to ramp up the production of plastics. So it is actually really sad. And I think if people would look at it, from a very comprehensive way, rather than just from the plastic straw perspective, which I get sometimes really annoyed by, then they would actually see it's not a disconnected issue, climate change and plastics. It's actually very much connected, interconnected.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to leave plastics to one side for the moment. And I want to move on to something which you just glanced over when you were describing the actual video, which was that you said that there are things that live on turtles. Explain that to me, because I did know this through actually conversations with a couple of different friends of mine, and one who's just written a very interesting article on turtles, and he was telling me all about this. But some people won't maybe appreciate that they're almost like a little mini ecosystem in themselves.
Oh yeah, I mean, turtles are almost like floating islands for certain critters, right? So if you have to think about your tiny, tiny organism living in the vast ocean, and you might not be as mobile as, for example, a sea turtle, you have to find ways of how to distribute and to procreate as well. And so you are looking for bigger animals that you can kind of latch onto. And a lot of times it doesn't cause any harm to the actual host. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it's a parasitic interaction, but a lot of times it's just kind of a commensalism. So they're just sitting on the turtles and kind of filter feeds on the way where the turtle is going as well. But what is super interesting is that actually, depending of where the turtle is traveling, because turtles are pretty far traveling, depending on the species, we actually have thousands of kilometers that are traveled between feeding grounds and nesting grounds. And you can actually look at those critters that live on the turtles and see where they might have originated from, because there are certain species that are only found in certain areas. And if you look at those what we call barnacles, it's a little crustacean Cirripedia that live on turtles quite often. They form little shells, if you want so. And when you look at those shells, you can actually see the layers as well, just as in like the turtle carapace itself as well.
Oh, interesting. So because they're building these, they're constructing their own little habitat with the deposits that are in the ocean. You're actually able to like break down I think a lot of it will be calcium deposits, won't it? And see where
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
actually come from.
Exactly. So for what we're going to talk later about, the whole stable isotope thing, so you can do the whole stable isotope analysis as well on those critters,
Oh, no way! I
and
hadn't even thought of
it can.
that.
There's a really cool study, that has come out of Australia. Ryan Pearson is his name. I hope I didn't mispronounce his name. Who has pretty much come up with this idea and done some incredible stuff on it for his PhD. And he has been able to pretty much track the turtle and the travel of the turtle by just looking at the barnacles that were on the turtles.
That's incredible. I think immediately what I'm thinking as you're explaining this to me is that how nature is connected and interacts across species is so incredibly complicated, and so much more complicated than we have even come close to understanding. And when we're thinking about, as we see in newspapers and in the media all the time, this species is suddenly being classed as endangered, or we've just lost this species, or it's functionally extinct in the wild, is the knock-on effects of all the other organisms that might rely on those species for their own survival. It really blows your mind if you start looking at it at the sort of microscopic level.
Oh, totally. I mean, I think a lot of people always just think about the large organisms, because they are usually more charismatic. But I mean, we there is a reason why we talk about keystone species, right? So if you think about, I don't know, a block somewhere in a wall and how much little critters, like how much little plants could actually grow on that, building block somewhere. And if would pull it out, the whole freaking wall would collapse. So this is pretty much the same thing with like large animals as well, or like large species that we might lose to extinction. And so nobody has even studied a lot of those small critters. And so that means we don't even know what we might lose, just because, I mean, I don't know, that's totally not a marine biology thing, but we have a moth that lives only on sloth here in Costa Rica. So if the sloth ever became extinct, that whole moth population or this whole species of moth would also go extinct because they need the sloth feces to actually reproduce. So they live on the moth when they live on the sloth, and when the moth needs to reproduce, they wait till the sloth is defecating, and then they lay their eggs into the feces of the sloth. So it's just an example of how much interconnection there is between small critters and big critters.
Wow, so they rely on the sloth for their entire life cycle, but there will be other animals
Yep.
that predate on the sloth and require them as part of their life cycle.
Absolutely. I mean, that is, more the predator-prey relationship. But, predators a lot of times are not super specialized depending of, who we're talking about. But there is, other specialists that are really like that have dietaries, that are very specialized in diet or in reproduction, for example, in the case of the sloth moth.
Yeah, I've actually just been reading quite a lot about biodiversity and biodiversity measures and the different metrics that we use and indicators that we use to try and encapsulate this really quite broad term, which is biodiversity. And the underlying message under and the big sort of takeaway from all of that is that we, in a way, even as scientists, not that I'm including myself in that bracket, but there's a lot of hope that these biodiversity measures encapsulate all the things that we still don't understand and still haven't even cataloged as species. We just hope that these measures, to the best of our knowledge and to the encompassing all the information that we have at this moment in time, will sort of take care of all the parts that we don't understand.
Correct. I mean, we a lot of times talk about, umbrella species amongst, the conservation community, where we pick a species that is, likely going to protect, or if we protect that particular species, we're not only protecting that species, but we're protecting its habitat. And also under the umbrella of that, so many other species that we don't even know that might be endangered or even depend on that species to survive or the habitat.
Yeah. I wanted to. I mean, this ties nicely into the main sort of thing that I wanted to talk to you about, which is based on a paper which you published called "Beyond Trophic Morphology." It was published in Biological Reviews, where you were looking at the trophic ecology between species and within species of marine turtles. Tell me a little bit about how that research came about, and then we can start to dig into some of the really intriguing findings from it, including the actual like evolution of turtles. I didn't know until I was reading through your paper just what an ancient species they are and how long they've basically remained unchanged.
Yeah, so the whole project actually became, it was pretty much the introduction to my PhD. So I was going to do a stable isotope study on a population here in Costa Rica.
Okay,
And,
sorry to interrupt you. Because I want people to understand all of this as we're going through, because I didn't know what this was either. Stable isotope study without like the super technical details, just exactly what it is scientifically and what that shows you.
Yeah, so stable isotope analysis pretty much utilizes a stable version of an existing element. So let's take, for example, carbon. And there is different versions of it. So you might have heard of carbon 15, for example, which is like the radioactive one that is kind of decaying over time, and you can carbon date old samples because of that. But there are also forms that are stable, that are actually not decaying. And for some reason, in the natural environment, depending how much of the stable carbon you have, the carbon 13, which is like the stable form versus the normal form, which is carbon 12, the ratio of the two kind of gives you an idea of what kind of photosynthetic pathway the plants are taking mainly. So I don't know, from your biology class, you might remember there were plants that have like a C3 and C4 pathway. My kind of, the general gist is that I can say in the ocean, for example, how close to the coast is an organism feeding, for example, because algae have a very different photosynthetic pathway than terrestrial plants. And if we're looking, for example, at nitrogen, I could take a snip from, for example, you, Byron, and say if you are a meat eater, so where in the food chain you are located, or if you're a vegetarian, or even a vegan, or a pescatarian. All of that is possible with stable isotopes. So we usually combine carbon and nitrogen to kind of have what we call a trophic niche, which is based on the isotopic niche. So it gives you us an idea of kind of the location, like the baseline produces with the carbon, and then where in the food chain is the individual that we've been sampling kind of positioned, if that makes sense.
Okay, so if you have a species that is predominantly eating some other organisms, some other fauna, but they predate on flora, are you able to work that out with this in the same way?
Yes.
So you can it's the whole trophic level from start to end.
Exactly, because it is not the most exact science. I don't want to lie about that, but if you especially have some, reference samples from, for example, your baseline producers, which are usually algae and other plants or seagrasses, for example, you are able, because you know what we call the trophic enrichment factor is. So that means from the plant that has a certain stable isotope ratio, to the animal that feeds on it, it's usually kind of an increase in 3 parts per thousand, if that makes sense. So that means I know if I have an increase from, my baseline producer that is like 9 or 12, for example, that I know, okay, that animal that I sampled is not, feeding directly on those plants, but is at least having probably 2 trophic steps in between.
I got it. Yeah. Sense. So you're looking at the trophic hierarchy, and you can kind of work out at what point they're interacting in that system and what they're feeding on.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. I thought that was important background before you carry on talking about your paper. So I think hopefully everyone can picture this, the actual process kind of stable isotopes in what you were trying to show in the study.
Yeah, and the whole study idea really came about, when I was starting on my project, and I really wanted to know, but, what is actually in the context of, all sea turtle species and on different places in the world, like, where is my population actually positioned? And, I just wanted to write a small introduction chapter to that. And it turned out to be this, like, 2-year project where I got really into every single study that has ever been published on sea turtles and stable isotopes. And it was really, really amazing, because what we started to see is that, evolutionary, we believe that the 7 existing species that we still have, the extant species, actually kind of diverged on the trophic axis. So that means the reason, a lot of them are sharing nesting grounds, for example, or even feeding grounds, locally, like geographically. So how is it possible that they're able to coexist without competing with each other? And a lot of times we thought, well, it must be the diet, right? Because we know that some of the species are super specialized. If we talk about the hawksbill turtle, they're feeding on sponges. We're talking about the leatherback turtles. They're mainly feeding on gelatinous prey, jellyfish mainly. We're talking about green turtles, which are thought that they would, feed mainly on seagrasses, so the vegetarian turtle amongst them all. And we had some omnivores as well.
And all of this ties with what a lot of people, if they're trying to rack their brains at like high school or maybe undergrad biology and what they learned about evolution, a lot of this ties with our very well established and basic understanding of evolution, which is species evolving and filling these ecological niches. And Darwin's finches, which you actually mention in that paper, is the example that most people will think of when we're talking about that, and the sort of development of beaks, in the same way as the turtles develop different shaped beaks for different feeding habits.
Exactly, yes. And so when we looked at it from this perspective, kind of assuming that this is what's happening, I set out and reviewed all the studies that existed on different species. And what we actually found is that it's a lot more complicated. Who
As nature
expected
normally
that,
is.
right? It's a lot more complicated. Yeah. So what we found is that, there is actually so much overlap in the species don't even stick to the expected diets, right? So for example, the green turtles that we thought are definitely vegetarian, actually probably not vegetarian. In some populations, definitely not. In, there is a lot more, yeah, interconnection probably again between, where they're feeding. So that means if I'm looking at a green turtle population here in Costa Rica, they might not do the same thing when I look into one that's like feeding in some Asian waters. So this is really cool and really interesting. I mean, it raises, of course, also a lot more questions than it answers it, but it also shows that sea turtles have really, well, like there are, it's like the 7 species that only exist. I mean, if you think about it, it's not that many species if you compare it to maybe marine mammals. There's hundreds of species of different dolphins and whatever not. It's that they have really, they occupy a large portion of the trophic niche within the ocean environment. So when you look at it, we haven't really worked that out so much in the paper because we already were very extensive in others' part. But if you look at the one of the main graphs where you can see how the different species have separated, into different groups, spatially. So that means, where they're feeding in the ocean. So that means how close to the coast, for example, or where in the water column are they feeding. So they're not competing with each other. And also in the food chain, so what position do they occupy to not compete with each other, which is super interesting. So it kind of conveys again this idea, yes, they have diverged on the trophic axis, but actually again it's a lot more varied than just their mandibles or what their mandibles look like. And it showed that looking a little bit deeper and not just taking morphology for granted, is that the evolution might continue. So maybe there is already kind of like microevolutions happening within species where maybe the green turtle populations that are now feeding not only on seagrass anymore, maybe, I don't know, in a million years it's going to be 2 different species that have specialized on 2 different kinds of diets. And maybe we will, well, in the end see that also in their trophic morphology. But probably the diet is coming first, and then maybe the specialization of any kind of mandibles and beaks.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, particularly as you highlighted in the paper, as to what this really means for the conservation of species, because it means that we now need to consider these within species changes and adaptations to maybe more specialized feeding habits. The one example that as I was reading that, the one example that really sprung to mind, and I think is maybe a bit more visual and maybe well-known example, is with killer whales and the actual hunting habits that different populations of killer whales have had and adapted over time. Some are feeding on fish, some are feeding on seals, and they've actually established these ecotypes. And they're not necessarily transferable. Just because it's a killer whale doesn't mean that a killer whale in one location of the world would necessarily be able to survive and hunt in another location of the world because of the prey abundance. And I think that is also true in what came through in the paper that you presented.
Correct. Yeah. So ecotypes and also the different conditions, because that maybe one ocean basin poses versus another one. Because we talk a lot about, in the case of, for example, the Eastern Pacific leatherback that is almost extinct in the Eastern Pacific. What could we do in order to prevent the extinction? Could we maybe transplant, for example, Atlantic leatherbacks to the Eastern Pacific? But this is very, very concerning to think about if okay, maybe they're not going to be adapted to the Eastern Pacific, even though if it's just like a micro adaptation, if you want. But it raises questions of feasibility of a lot of measurements that could be done maybe to prevent extinction. Because in the case of killer whales, for example, it's not just the diet, right? It's actually the culture as well. So they have different
Absolutely.
languages.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if you
It's fascinating.
probably put them together, they wouldn't even be able to communicate. I mean, sea turtles don't have such a complex social life, but I mean, we know that there is something happening in the Eastern Pacific that we are not entirely sure of why the Eastern Pacific population is faring so badly compared to the Atlantic one. Because fishery, we have it in both ocean basins. They have more or less the same diet, but we can see already that the Eastern Pacific always had a lower reproductive output, for example, longer remigration intervals between, the different nesting seasons. And they're also a little bit smaller. So it seems to be maybe food availability is different, or maybe the metabolism is different. That's another, possibility. We don't really know. That's the thing. And maybe there's other stuff that we haven't even thought about that might also play into the whole thing. Maybe they have, I don't know, specialized gut bacteria that, wouldn't be able to digest the diet if we would transplant, for example, an Atlantic leatherback to the Eastern Pacific. I mean, not that this is really a thing, but there is so many little things that, so many variables that we don't know anything about pretty much, and that we still have to account for if we are going to manipulate for the sake of preventing extinction, for example.
Do you think this highlights one of the problems with this continued focus that we seem to have, whether that be from the sort of the general public and how we discuss extinctions and conservation in the media, but also in the scientific community, of focusing on species, when clearly here we're looking at the necessity to focus on components within species, like beyond the just like the pure genetic units of species definition.
Well, I mean, I think this kind of circles back to what you just mentioned with biodiversity, right? I mean, it's biodiversity on different scales, right? So we talk about biodiversity within maybe an ecosystem, but we also talk about maybe not biodiversity, but diversity within a species. So, I mean, of course, if we think about like Homo sapiens, if we would have to save the species Homo sapiens, yeah, but who would be or like the one, which where would we start? Like, would we go to Asia and take a couple there, or would we go to Africa, or would we go to North America?
Yeah.
I
What's the
mean,
type
you know what I'm
specimen for
getting
that?
at? I mean,
Yeah.
we're all the one species, but there's so much variation. And even we have like, different adaptations to our environments, or that there is certain like food intolerance is more prevalent in certain demographics than in others. So I think it's not that easy. It's not, the sea turtle that we're going to protect or the leatherback turtle, but we need to make sure that whatever conservation measurements we're taking, that we're protecting the diversity within the species as well. I mean, it kind of kills two birds with one stone, because we already know that, the more genetic diversity, it also makes for a healthier population and a more resilient population for sure. Because, in the case of the cheetahs, I don't know, I'm sure you're familiar with that story. I mean, the whole population has pretty much sprung back from literally like one breeding couple. And I think what I've heard is that they're pretty, genetic, not very diverse. And there's always the fear that if there might be this like virus or any other kind of disease that is, adapted to this one specific genetic, they might kill the entire cheetah population again, because there is not that much diversity left anymore.
Yeah, it's. I think that speaks to something which is so incredibly important when we're focusing our mind on conservation, is that if we allow species through, whatever the drivers are that cause this, to shrink down to these tiny populations, and there are a multitude of examples of species which are down to very small populations around the world. Even if you are able to recover those species, look at white rhinos and black rhinos and tigers, even if you can recover those, in the long term, you might never be able to really fix the effects of having those tiny populations because exactly as you said, that genetic diversity is lost. It is gone. You can't really get it back, not over any kind of timescale that's useful to humans.
Exactly. No. And I mean, there also is, we always think about genetic, it's like something fixed, but there's so many things that genetics, kind of give you a little determination of what you will look like as a phenotype, but there's so much that actually your environment also determines, in species that are learning certain things are learned. Maybe you acquire certain, again, gut bacteria or language or else that unless you are particularly looking for it and conserving that, you are missing that and you are losing that as well. And that is it's such a challenge. And I think, of course, we like to simplify things so people understand better, but I think sometimes we really need to embrace the complicatedness of our natural world and also be very humble about manipulating it. I mean, there's so many things that have gone wrong in conservation because people just thought, oh, it's like fixing a car. I take this part out and I put this other part in, and it kind of has the same function, and then hopefully everything is working afterwards. And it's just not.
Is there, and this might be a far too sweeping generalization, but if you were to just pick one or two of the main drivers that have been negatively affecting marine turtle populations around the world, what do we need to consider? What are the big takeaways?
Oh, the big drivers. Well, unfortunately, it really is human exploitation in different senses. So fisheries is one of the big issues.
As a bycatch?
Because, well, yeah, I mean, that is one thing. I mean, exploitation, like targeted by exploitation is, of course, another problem. That's the second part of the exploitation. But for fisheries, commercial fisheries, it's mainly bycatch. And we have so many turtles that, and it's always about turtles that you have to think about. They have an incredibly long generation time, right? So from a little baby turtle up until it's reaching sexually maturity, the fastest species reach it in maybe 15, 20 years. But we have species that are thought to not reach sexual maturity until 45 years. So you have these
Wow.
adult turtles, right? Like the ones that have survived all the dangers out there. They are finally ready to, contribute to the next generation. And then they die as bycatch. Not even because somebody wants to eat them, no, just kind of useless bycatch somewhere in our oceans. And just to give you a number, here in Costa Rica, the olive ridley turtle, within 5 years, and that's a very conservative estimate, we have lost about 600,000 turtles as bycatch for like fishes just on the Pacific side in Costa Rican waters in 5 years. It's horrible. And then the other problem, of course, is targeted exploitation. But it is definitely a smaller percentage, but it's just as, I don't know, disturbing for me if I go onto the beach and, sometimes I can handle better if people just go and steal some eggs, and maybe not even the entire clutch of eggs, just like, a turtle is laying maybe 150 eggs in some species and they take 10 or 20 eggs. Well, so be it. If they eat it, great, if they needed to feed their family. But what makes me really upset is, again, when they kill the adult turtles, so even in their logic, they need to understand that if they want to keep doing what they're doing, they need babies. They need babies to be produced to grow into adults so they can go out and kill some more adults. But it's just not happening if they kill all the adults that come in nest.
Is it the case that species which do have much longer lifespans? I mean, I'm thinking, there are elephants, humans. We live quite a long time. Turtles, they have a greater vulnerability to anthropogenic effects.
Well, I mean, I think it depends a little bit on your reproductive strategy as well. Because if you think about humans or elephants, you have parental care, whereas in sea turtles, for example, surprisingly, for that they're such a long-lived species, they actually they're not having parental care, right? So it's a more quantity over quality strategy that they have. So females go just kind of like huge masses of eggs into the sand, and then they hope for the best. And we know more or less that, from like, let's say 1,000 or 300 to 1,000 babies, only one reaches sexual maturity. So, I mean, I think it's more about, since you need to survive so many years, that there is maybe this the vulnerability that you have been talking about. That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
Just
mean, at least an elephant, an elephant mother can help their babies to survive, right? Or we humans, we're definitely able to help our kids to reach sexual maturity. Sea turtles are really out there fending for themselves, once they leave the egg.
Yeah, and the implications of losing one mature, sexually mature adult is, well, you just gave us the numbers. Did you say 300,000 to get one?
No, 300 to 1,000. I mean,
Three.
the statistic
Okay.
is a little bit warped. We have always been talking about this one out of 1,000, and we've recently tried to backtrack where this actually originated, because everyone uses that statistic, and we haven't really been able, as like the sea turtle biology community, come up with where that statistic originated. So
It's
yeah.
funny because there's a lot of instances like that in for different things, different ecological communities, and you see these statistics continually come up. One that I can think of at home is that Scotland has 70% of the world's heather moorland. And it was pointed out to me quite recently that everyone uses that, everybody quotes it, and yet where did it actually come from? And it's something I need to dig into more, because I actually am not quite sure how accurate that really is. And we take for granted these very commonly thrown out, just sort of accepted numbers sometimes. But I mean, that is, well, in terms of making sure that you facilitate good science, you need to really understand where those numbers come from.
Yeah, totally. And this is the reason I'm saying with caution. But you will find that statistic everywhere. Governments use it, scientists use it without even, looking for citations, or citing another paper that's citing another paper that's citing another paper, and you never get to the
Yeah, I know that is a problem. Christine, it's been, I don't want to keep you any longer because I know that you had to turn the fan off in your room so that we could podcast, and it's sweltering hot there. It's been an incredible discussion on a topic that I'm actually have recently found a fascination for. I would love to come to your part of the world and witness this with my own eyes, and maybe dig into some of this research more, and maybe bring some more content to people to understand and learn more about this incredible collection of species, which at the moment really, really do need our help. And you're doing some incredible work down there. And I will put all the links to the paper that we've talked about, and also your website and some of the other work that you've been involved in the link, so people can click through and go and learn a little bit more. But I really appreciate you taking the time out today.
Thank you so much, Baron. And yeah, if you hear something dripping, that was probably my sweat. Just kidding. Um, Just kidding. But no, thank you so much for having me. And you're definitely welcome to come and visit us during sea turtle nesting season.
Well, thank you very
Usually
much.
March till October.
Okay, it's I don't need to be asked twice. I will have to try and make that happen.